Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Recently in the lead up to the US presidential election, the likes of Barack Obama were telling men in America, especially black men, that they should vote for Kamala Harris simply because she's a woman. More recently, Justin Trudeau stated publicly that he was lamenting that the Americans did not elect a female president in 2024, and that this is somehow some failure of the cause of feminism. But what's being lost in all of this is what is happening to men in Western culture and Western society. There is a real tragedy, a travesty that is occurring where young men are not finishing high school, they're not going to college, they're not living as long, they're not as healthy, they're not as well adjusted. They're simply not doing as well as women, and there are some very good reasons why. So our guest today is an expert in this. He'll be able to tell us a lot of the reasons why this is happening, and also in the context of domestic abuse and violence. His name is Edward Bartlett. Welcome to the program, Edward. It's great to have you on Grey Matter today.
Thank you. Great to see you, Leighton.
So before we get in and get in earnest and introduce our guest properly, as we always do, we're going to go to our framing aphorisms. The first one hopefully will make you laugh and might make you cry a little bit. It's sort of the slogan of second wave feminism, which was "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle." The next one is from somebody who is not generally thought of as a feminist, the late Marilyn Monroe, who said, "Look like a girl, act like a lady, think like a man, and work like a boss." Next, somebody who definitely does recognize herself or affirm herself as a girl boss, as a feminist, and that's Hillary Clinton, who said, "I believe the rights of women and girls is the unfinished business of the 21st century." And finally, from Justin Trudeau, who said, "I'll keep saying I'm a feminist until there's no reaction." Well, who do we have in the show today? Well, his name is Edward Bartlett. He is the founder of an important coalition that we're going to talk about today. And he's received his PhD from the esteemed Johns Hopkins University. He's a former faculty member at 3 universities and also a former federal regulator at the Department of Health and Human Services. He's authored over 100, that's 100 peer-reviewed articles and editorials. He's also the proud father of 3 and an avid bicyclist. We have that in common. So, Edward, thanks for being with us on the show today.
And
So,
thank you for that very, very gracious introduction. And I will only add, I'm also an avid hockey fan.
oh,
So
wonderful.
I always look to see the Leafs getting into the Stanley Cup Finals just because, hey, it's their turn.
Yeah, it's only been what since 1967. There actually is a T-shirt, Edward, that is a Maple Leafs fans T-shirt. You I actually bought this for my son, who's a Leafs fan, and it says "Once more before I die." So that gives you an
Yeah.
idea where things are with the Leafs. But hey,
Yeah. Get,
we're,
get me one of those shirts, would you
y- y-
please?
yeah, and by way of segue, some people might say that being a Leafs fan is a form of domestic abuse, at least domestic to Canada. But hey, seriously, you're working on something really, really important. And when I found out about you, I just had to have you on the program because I actually wrote a piece a few years ago uh, for this show that's called "Kill All Men." Do you remember that? That was a tagline
Oh,
that was
absolutely. I
around the
remember it
20.
very well.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it was not meant to be a joke. It was actually meant to be somewhat serious, and it's truly horrifying. So why don't we start here? Why don't you tell us a little bit about Davia, the Domestic Abuse and Violence International Alliance? Because this is something that I think is doing very important work, but very few people really know about it.
Yeah, certainly. So you were talking earlier about the feminist narrative. And one of the key parts of the feminist narrative is that domestic violence is always men beating up their wives or men beating up their girlfriends. It's always unidirectional. Well, guess what? There's literally been hundreds of studies around the world looking at what is the truth of domestic violence. It turns out men and women, it's an equal opportunity problem. Women are just as likely to engage in domestic violence. And if you look at lesbians, by far the highest rates of domestic violence of any group, whether it's homosexuals, heterosexual, the highest rates of
Really? That is
violence are
astonishing.
among lesbian couples. And yeah, it for sure. It's one of these, huge problems that feminists never want to talk about.
Wow. And
So,
yeah.
just to answer your question a little bit,
Hmm.
so the purpose of the Domestic Abuse and Violence International Alliance, that we affectionately refer to as DAVIA, is an organization working to rectify this false understanding and change the laws that are in many countries are very biased against men, and in some countries simply have zero recognition of male victims of domestic violence. So we have 168 members scattered around the globe in 38 countries. So that's what we do.
How did this get started? And when did this get started?
Yeah. So uh, DAVIA, Domestic Abuse and Violence International Alliance, began 3 years ago, and we had done work just in primarily in the United States. There has been work in Canada, similar work. Don Dutton, who's at University of British Columbia, is one of the leading researchers in Canada. But we had focused primarily on the U.S. But we began to realize that our opposition was organized internationally. If we were going to be effective in changing this misconception and changing the policies, we had to become organized internationally as well.
Hmm. Uh, I read a book a few years ago. You're probably familiar with the British writer and philosopher Douglas Murray. And he's written a series of books. One of them is called The Madness of Crowds. And in that book, he referred to this kill all men that I mentioned. He said this. He says, kill all men might have been an overzealous way to call for female suffrage at a time when women did not have the vote. First wave feminists campaigning for equality by saying kill all men would have been a deranged way to try to get people on their side. But he says a century later, it appeared to have become normal and indeed acceptable for women born with all the rights their forebears had fought for to react with more violent language than had been employed when the stakes were infinitely higher. He says if somebody has the competency to do something and the desire to do something, then nothing about the race, sex, or sexual orientation should hold them back. But minimizing differences is not the same as pretending that difference does not exist. To assume that sex, sexuality, and skin color mean nothing is ridiculous. But to assume that they mean everything will be fatal. And I think his point is, it seems to be okay to express violent language and to be physically violent against one particular demographic, and that happens to be men. Why is that the case, Edward? How do we get here?
Well, let's go back to the narrative, okay? So the feminist narrative has always really the core piece of the feminist narrative is that the world is driven by what they refer to as patriarchy.
Right.
Okay, now they don't really define what patriarchy is, but they give you the impression that this is a cabal of
Hmm.
of powerful, wealthy men who basically sit back in their armchairs, conniving. How are we going to make things even more difficult, more unpleasant for women all around the world? It's like this giant um, uh, uh, plot to subjugate women. Well, of course, the idea of patriarchy actually can be traced back to Marxist thinking. The
Hmm.
idea is just utterly absurd. I've never even received an invitation to join the patriarchy. There is no such organization anywhere in the world. I know because I researched. But the reality is that there is something you might call matriarchy, and the matriarchy is found especially at UN Women. That's the agency at the United Nations that's uh, in theory is working for gender equality, but we could talk about that. Anyway, so much of this comes back to this false narrative that implicates all men as being the enemies of women. Well, hey, what about chivalry? Well,
Right.
you'll never hear a feminist admit even the existence of chivalry, but we all know as in common sense and common life, chivalry is a very powerful motivation. Anyway, so much of these problems, Leighton, come back to this false narrative of patriarchy.
And this idea, this concept of patriarchy and how it subjugates uh, women it gets more and more false the closer you get to the facts. And here's a few facts, and I won't get you to comment this on this. When it comes to being crushed, mutilated, electrocuted, or mangled at work, men are at a distinct disadvantage because most backbreaking, lethally dangerous jobs like roofing, logging, being a roustabout, coal miner, underwater welder, to name a few, are done by men. 90%, folks, 90% of workplace related deaths each year are men. But all we hear about in the leftist media is the travesty of not enough lady CEOs running the Fortune 500. So here's my question to you, Edward. How did this presumption, the bare presumption that we need more women CEOs, judges, heads of Harvard University, presidents. How did this presumption come into being? Where did we come up with this idea that without more, it's better to have more women in these places? Shouldn't we be looking for the best people to do these particular jobs as opposed to picking people based upon purely upon gender?
So absolutely yes, and so we understand how this has come to pass. So feminists originally talked about gender equality, and everybody nodded their head like, well, of course, who could be opposed to gender equality in the sense of equal opportunities and equal rights? I
Mm-hmm.
think everybody pretty much agrees with that. But surprise, surprise, feminists did a little switcheroo. They changed the definition of gender equality to not just equal opportunities or equal rights. They changed it to mean uniform outcomes. Okay, in other
Mm.
words, hey, if there's 50% of male lawmakers in Ontario or in Canada. Well, obviously, there also have to be 50% female lawmakers. Now, they never apply that logic to like the workplace deaths example that you just provided. Women are never talking about, hey, we need to hire more females as uh, d- uh, uh, deep mine uh, operators, as loggers, as roofers. They never talk about that because those are the jobs that are most likely to kill, right?
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
anyway, so it was a clever switcheroo. We're going to change from equal opportunities to identical outcomes.
Right, right, and this sort of faulty logic that second wave feminists deploy is something like in cases where men are better off than women, an injustice has necessarily occurred, but where women are doing better, that is the world moving as it should, atoning for past injustice. But if Mars needs to check his privilege, then so too does Lady Venus, right? Or am I speaking out of school here? I'm upsetting feminists right now watching
Yeah,
this.
well, you forgot one thing, Leighton. The future is female, right?
Right,
You've
of
heard that
course,
phrase, I'm sure.
of course.
Well, that of course was heralded by Hillary Clinton herself. And once you start thinking that, and once that gets into the back of your brain, it's kind of very easy to justify any injustice or any, you know, example where, for example, around the world, men are dying on the average 5 years younger than
Hmm.
women
Yeah.
all around the world, almost every country, there's this amazing disparity. Now, some countries like Russia and Ukraine, it's a 12-year disparity of longevity. A few countries, it's only like 2 or 3 years, like Japan. But bottom line is, on average, it's about a 5-year longevity gap. Um, and so, why is that? We need to talk. I mean, suicide is a good example of
Hmm.
why one of the reasons why men are dying so much earlier.
Hmm. We're even seeing this in our country. You've probably heard that medical assistance in dying or MAID in Canada, where we're actually becoming a world leader in murdering our own population.
Yes.
It's now the fifth leading cause of death in Canada. And it won't surprise you, Edward, to learn that the number of people, number of men deciding to participate in MAID is much higher than it is in women. Are you shocked by that?
I had never heard that fact before, but I'm not surprised. I was aware of that new law, which in itself is kind of shocking. Um, and I'll tell you, I've given a lot of thought to this problem of suicide, which I think is related to the question you're posing right now.
Hmm.
And when you think about it, there are so many ways that the deck is stacked against men, and it begins with you know boys that don't behave. They are punished more severely than girls who misbehave. um, Boys are not doing as well in school. Boys are less likely to enroll in college. You start putting all these pieces together, and I could kind of go on for 15 minutes giving examples of how men and boys are disadvantaged in Canada and around the world. But you put all these together, you say, "Wow!" I mean, there are a lot of men that give up. That they are truly pushed to their limit, and they're pushed beyond their limit. They feel that you know, they've lost contact with their family, maybe because of divorce, and they
Hmm.
feel that they have nowhere else to go.
Hmm. Hmm. It seems to be particularly acute in young men. I'm sure you saw this story recently, Edward. The complainant in this famous Duke story that happened 20 years ago, or back in 2006, came out and said, "Oh, well, actually, I lied. I made the whole thing up." And of course,
Yes.
we all saw, the public shaming of Johnny Depp with the Amber Heard trial. This Me Too movement, if we can call it that, has really had really serious long term impacts in terms of abuse of men in society, hasn't it?
It very much has so, but I think we are seeing a change. That we're seeing a disillusionment among women with the feminist narrative, and I'll give you a couple examples. Um, we know that the mental health problems among women, especially young liberal women, are quite high. 56% in the US, 56% of young liberal women have been told by a healthcare provider that they have a mental condition. Um, you may have heard of this woman in England. Her name is Leilani Phillips.
Right.
This
Hmm.
was reported just last week. All right, Leilani Phillips bedded 100 different men in a single day, and that's what she boasted about this because, hey, this is sexual liberation.
Hmm.
Now, something has really gone wrong when people start having intercourse with 100 different people in one day. Think that's like 5 minutes per person through an entire, an entire day.
Hmm.
I mean, there are a lot of people saying this is just utterly absurd.
Hmm. And that's an interesting story because the feminists and the leftist media jumped all over this, and of course they spun this into an exploitation story. They spun this into a patriarchy story. But in fact,
Right.
what you really have here is you have a woman who is exploiting men as so many women are on things like OnlyFans. But more than that, she's actually degrading and dehumanizing herself. She's actually the author of her own unhappiness. And the scary thing about it is she doesn't seem to realize it. In fact, she's talking about going back and breaking her own record. How is this possible, ever? How do we get here? We've just lived. It seems that we one view of this seems, and I have this argument with a friend of mine who's a law professor, brilliant law professor in Canada named Bruce Party, and I'm a conservative. He's a liberal. And I say to him, well, is what's happening right now? Are we seeing the limits of liberalism? That actually, if you take liberalism out to its outermost limits, that it actually results in nihilism. What do you think about that?
I think you've said it exactly right. It is, we are seeing the ultimate limits of what happens when you start believing in patriarchy, when you start saying, okay, there's I as a woman, I have no need to associate or marry with members of the opposite sex. Uh, Childbearing is oppressive. Um, we're seeing the logical consequence of that line of thinking. And OnlyFans is one of those. Um, and we're seeing, it's really interesting. We are seeing a growing polarization,
Hmm.
not just in North America. This is around the world, a growing polarization between young women and young men.
Hmm.
Young women are veering sharply to the left. Young men are moving moderately to the right. So we have this 15-point disparity or differential in how young men and young women are viewing the world. And, and that doesn't bode well for our future and for, shared relationships and so forth. So yeah, I think we truly. I think you used the word nihilism.
Hmm.
That's true. I mean, we're seeing people that you reach a point of such absurdity where you've heard the phrase Catwoman, right? Well,
Yes.
that's not just a joke. There are a lot of women who have never married, never had children, are now in their 60s and their 70s, and when they have a birthday, they celebrate their birthday alone.
Mm. You talked about Marxism earlier. And for people who have studied Marxism, they know that core to Marxism is this concept of alienation. And that's really what's happening here between the sexes, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the story that's in the Old Testament and throughout the Bible, and also really throughout human history, even looking at it, any sort of rational look at anthropology, the real story of the sexes is basically men and women working together, cooperating to try and overcome a planet that's constantly trying to kill us. That's the real story. And of course, we came up with something called the family. We were gifted this concept of the family. And this alienation that's built within Marxism, it lies at the heart of this abuse, doesn't it? Because if we can alienate the other, when we can be separate from the other, when we otherize everybody, when we objectify other people, that's kind of the seeds of violence, isn't it?
Yeah, and let's sort of uncover the Marxist connection a little bit more. So first of all, I want to emphasize there is absolutely no doubt that feminism is based on Marxist theory. In fact, there's an entire book titled "Red Feminism." I've read the book. It was written by a feminist. Everything is footnoted. Everything is documented. It takes the emergence and the development of feminism, ever since the mid 1800s, step by step, and showing how, from the early writings of Karl Marx, he talked about the family being the source of oppression of women.
Right, right, yes.
I mean,
Hmm.
he himself said that. So,
Hmm.
is it any surprise that feminists are have set out to essentially marginalize and destroy the family? So, and Marxism, they Marxism claims to be working for equality. Well, that's kind of a charade. Marxism is not just about eliminating economic differences. They want to eliminate all social differences, including differences of sex, right?
Hmm.
So, maybe you're wondering, well, where does transgenderism come from? It comes from Marxism, because what better way to eliminate, you know, distinctions of sex than to just declare there is no such thing as sex. It's just your gender identity. Take your pick.
Right.
Day one or day two, it's totally fluid.
Hmm. And again, transgender is a great example when you talk about alienation, because it's alienation from basically everything and everyone, even from your own body, from your own family, your own identity. You're alienated from. It's like one of the greatest ideas the enemy ever came up with. But the scary thing when I was researching you is that I knew that stuff like this was going on in the West, in places like the United States and Canada and Great Britain. But I was shocked to learn that the type of domestic abuse that you study is actually happening all over the world, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a global phenomenon. There's been studies done, to my knowledge, in 40 different countries and every continent except Antarctica, um, and it's really astonishing. Um, uh, to see these studies. If you look under Feibert, Feibert, he compiled these literally hundreds of studies. You can look at them for yourself. Whether you're talking about
Hmm.
North America, Europe, uh, Asia, India, Latin America. We're seeing the same. It's called symmetry. The same levels
Hmm.
of domestic violence by both men and women. And another interesting part of this is that if you look at teenage girls when they're dating teenage boys, it turns out every study showing that teenage girls are substantially higher, more likely to be the perpetrators of domestic abuse than
Hmm.
the teenage boys. But again, that's that's been that's been eliminated from the popular narrative.
Right. But some of these numbers in terms of false accusations of abuse are really, really shocking. Like in India, 19%, Australia, 10%, US, 10%, Canada, 8%. We're talking about that those numbers may sound low, but when you put them into context, we're talking about in the millions, the many, many millions of people are being falsely accused all around the world, to the point where
Right,
since 2021, and I was heartened to hear this, there's actually an International Falsely Accused Day. So that's how prevalent this is, right?
right. You're exactly right. And like, let's just take England, which has one of the lowest rates of false allegations, 4%.
Right.
But wait, multiply 4% by the total adult population of England. I think that's something like 12 million people.
Oh,
Something, I
yeah.
mean, we're talking about millions of people who say they've been falsely accused of some form of abuse, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault,
Hmm.
child abuse, or stalking. So those are really stunning numbers. And yes, people are beginning to speak out strongly. You may have heard that just in Argentina last month they had a full day hearing in the Argentinian Senate. And get this, they heard from a 15-year-old girl. She herself had falsely accused her own father of sexually molesting her. She admitted it was false, but to this day, that man is still in prison in Argentina. So if you want to see a heartrending, tearful account, that happened just a few weeks ago in Argentina. So yeah, this is a global problem.
Hmm. But part of the abuse, and you talk about this in your research, is the weaponizing of this mythology, this feminist guilt trip, to get men to vote in certain ways. And this was very much front and center during the recent presidential election, where liberals in the United States were agonizing on how to recapture the male vote, because men, especially young men, are just really turned off by this stuff. So do you see this as an encouraging sign that maybe the paradigm is starting to shift?
I think I don't think there's any doubt that the paradigm is being questioned, it's being attacked. When you talk about 56% of young liberal women have been told that they have a mental health problem, that's a number that really should shock everybody and start thinking, wow, what the heck is happening? And then add the problem of the suicide rates of young men, of older men. You have to think, wow, we have really gone in the wrong direction here. Let's reconsider a lot of these assumptions about patriarchy, about misogyny. I mean, there's so many myths floating out there, but you try to scratch a little bit deeper, these myths just disappear.
Hmm. Well, there seemed to be a real shift in the most recent U.S. Election, where exit polls showed that strong majorities of married men, men with children, white men, and Latino men all pulled the lever in favor of Trump. And in fact, this led the good people at CNN and elsewhere to talk about something called the testosterone podcast election. You know, but there's something. something that there's something deeper to this, isn't it? It's just not as simple as the 2024 election. Really, the shift that we're talking about, this has been building for a long time, hasn't it?
Well, I agree. It has been building, and I think we hit the flashpoint on November the 5th, at least in the United States. But, it's also true in Canada. So we are seeing a sea change, not just in North America. We're seeing this, I'm seeing this across the world. Davia, of course, is a international organization. I track these trends across the world, across the globe. We are seeing a sea change, and thank God, not a day too soon.
Well, I want to talk about Davi a little bit because this is really a remarkable organization doing incredible work. It's described as I went to the website and looked at it. It's a global human rights organization that addresses the interrelated issues of domestic abuse, domestic violence, false allegations, parental alienation, and shared parenting, particularly how these issues affect men and families. And we talked a little bit about feminism and things like that. We haven't talked about how this impacts parental alienation and shared parenting. You want to talk about how men are being discriminated against through feminism and the abuse of courts?
Yeah, definitely. So I've talked earlier about this really pernicious myth about male perpetrated domestic violence, but it turns out the myth has extended beyond that. So when you hear conversations about child abuse, okay, we know in the United States, mothers are more likely, substantially more likely, to be the perpetrators of child abuse. If we look globally at infant murders, 72% of infant murders are perpetrated by their mothers. So, so those are the facts. That's what we know from science. But when you hear people discussing these things, um, feminists will always give you the impression that virtually all child abuse is committed by their fathers.
Mhm.
That is just a bunch of hooey. But that's one way that they are biasing the whole family court system, because once judges begin to believe that factoid, and once they accept unsubstantiated accusations, in other words, an accusation with no hard evidence to back it up, you can see where how that system has gone awry.
Mhm.
If people truly believe in gender equality, they should be working for shared custody, equal shared custody between fathers and mothers in virtually every instance. But
Mhm.
that's not happening.
No, and I can tell you in Canada, based upon my experience with the courts, and my firm does a lot of family law type work. This Me Too presumption that all women must be believed is very, very much accepted by the courts, to the great detriment of not only fathers but children, because children need fathers, don't they? I mean, we all the statistics are looking at outcomes for men and women can be traced back to either absentee fathers or fathers who are abusive for whatever reason. And the presence of a strong father figure in a child's life seems to be one of the key determiners of success and well-adjusted living for young people. So one thing I want to ask you, Edward, is obviously you had a very strong career, successful career in academia. Uh, how did you get involved? I mean, now Davia has member organizations in over 35 countries, and you engage in advocacy and policy development, public awareness, litigation, research. But how did you find yourself kind of being at the forefront of this movement?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I often ask myself that same question, and I'll be very honest with you. I grew up in an abusive family,
Mhm.
and in particular, it was an abusive mother. And without going into details, I lived I lived with that abuse for many years, and the abuse was so severe I didn't even really recognize the harm it caused to me until many years later, right?
Wow.
So
Wow.
I finally sort of worked through. There was obviously a sense of anger, And it took me a while to work through that anger. So, I'll be honest with you. I have some personal experiences
Hmm.
with this issue that perhaps may motivate me to help others to make this a fairer system.
Hmm. What, and not to get too personal, but since you went there, what was the key for you to work your way through the emotional and psychological trauma that you suffered?
Wow. I think I just realized, beginning in my 30s, I began to realize that something just didn't feel right.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
I couldn't really put a label to it. I couldn't put a name to it, but things just didn't feel quite right. And I spent some time, I used to keep a diary and so forth, and, having conversations with other men and so forth. And I did some counseling, and it was a process, right?
Hmm.
It took a number of years to sort of work through that hurt, but yeah, the hurt was palpable.
Hmm. No, this is something that I've experienced myself in my own life, and coincidentally, around the same time in my own life, when I believe I was 30 years old, I had a similar experience to you in my household. Uh, very, very, very difficult, sort of dysfunctional upbringing. And what happened to me, and maybe this will resonate with you and other people, is I got the idea that I was going to fix everything by focusing on achievement, outward achievement. And there are many people I discovered later on uh, like this who overachieve outwardly because they're hiding or compensating for some inner pain. Celebrities are great examples of this. But the problem is, at some point, and for me, I was 30 years old, like you. I found that outwardly everybody looked at my life and said, "Wow, Leighton's doing really great," but inside I felt terrible. Like there was just a big empty hole in my life, and I didn't know how to fill it. Now, fortunately for me, I filled that up with my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. I found, but that's what went went there and filled up that space for me, and it transformed my life. It changed everything for me, and I prayed that everybody else could find that Savior too. But I think it's interesting, and I mentioned this to you, and I thank you for sharing this personal experience, which obviously resonates with me. But I think it would surprise a lot of people who would look outwardly at someone like Edward Bartlett and say, "Wow, this guy in his early 30s, he's got it all together. He's got his PhD, he's got it going on." But you're not living inside somebody else's life. It's like what my father used to say. You don't know what another man's experiencing until you've walked a mile in his moccasins.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, I had a wonderful father. Of course, he's passed away a number of years ago. But anyway, he was just sort of everything I could hope for in a father, both in terms of his affection as well as a good role model. He taught me how to use tools and on and on. So yeah, I think everybody finds their own path, but I think the bottom line message I would share, especially to men listening to this broadcast, is if you're feeling some pain, find out why. Talk to people about that pain. Um, your pain is you're not unique or different because you have that pain. Um, Talk it through, get help, and you'll be amazed how you become a stronger man.
Hmm. Hmm. So, Edward, if people are listening to this or watching it and they want to get involved, they want to support what you're doing, they want to support Davia. How do they do that?
Well, first of all, let me give you the our web address. So it's end2 as in to end2dv, dv meaning domestic violence, .org / Davia, Davia. Yeah,
And can people give? Can they provide financial support for the work that you're doing?
yeah, certainly. So yeah, they can send a check, or we have. Um, I'll provide my email address so people can wish to provide So it's info at end2dv.org.
Wonderful.
Info at end2dv.org.
Mhm. Well, it's so refreshing. I have to say, I was so excited when I learned about you, Edward, and Davia, and the work that you're doing. It's so needed. It's one of my great laments. My concerns as a father of two young men. I have a 20, one who's about to be 21, another is going to be 18, and I have great concern as a father about the world that these young men are coming into. It's not the same as it was for you and me. It's scary. It's a dangerous world, and I was so excited and pleased to learn about the work that Davia is doing because it's so vital, and we really need more of this because we're up against a real monster, this Marxist feminist Leviathan, aren't we?
And the words you use are perfect. The Marxist feminist Leviathan, that it describes it perfectly. But the good news is that public opinion is shifting, both men and women.
Hmm.
There was a woman named Carrie Gress,
Right.
Gress, that wrote a whole book about how trying to destroy patriarchy has destroyed women. So
Mm.
there are a lot of women who have become disillusioned. And I'll just say some of our best, strongest members of Davia are women-led organizations in a variety of countries. By the way, we have, I believe, 8 member organizations in Canada. So we're very proud of that fact as
Wow.
well.
Isn't that remarkable that you're getting so much support from women's groups? Wow, incredible. And that was a perfect segue into the last part of our show. We've kept you for a while and we're so grateful for your time, but we're turning to our reading list. And you've already given us a couple of great references to books. I've got a couple I'm going to refer to, and then perhaps you could finish off with a couple of recommendations, Edward. The first one is one that's called The Feminist Lie. You might be familiar with this one. It's by a man named Bob Lewis, and the description is that feminist ideology has seeped into every aspect of our society, as Everett and I have been discussing here. And this book is a sober and true story of tragedy, suicide, and murder directly caused by feminism. It not only chronicles true stories that show feminism's discrimination against men, it's backed by peer reviewed research. Additionally, it includes investigative journalism that proves feminism was never about equality, as Edward has explained. The reality is that feminism doesn't just victimize men, it also victimizes women, children, families, and communities. So that book is called The Feminist Lie. It Was Never About Equality by Bob Lewis. The second book I'm going to recommend is called Red Pill 101, The Hard Truths That Your Father Should Have Taught You. And the description is men today are looking for answers. For the past few generations, men and masculinity have been under attack on all sides, as we've been talking about with our guest today. Whether it's from the women in our lives who raised their boys as malfunctioning girls, our legal system that continues to systematically discriminate against men, or the plethora of books, movies, and entertainment that continually bash and portray men to be useless buffoons as punchlines. Men have grown up in a world that has steered them wrong at every turn. And this has led to feelings of confusion, anger, and even despair. And why shouldn't it? We've been lied to your entire life. And the author says, I know this because I was lied to as well. And so this book provides some explanation, not only to diagnose the problem, but also things that you can do to sort of fight this. What did I call it? A Marxist feminist Leviathan. Anyway, those are the two books that are going on our reading list today. And Everett, I'm going to turn to you for the last word. You've already mentioned a couple of that sound really fascinating. Are there any others that you would recommend for our viewers and listeners to learn more about the work that Davia is doing and some of the issues that you've been sharing with us today?
There was an excellent book written by Christina Hoff Sommers titled "The War on Boys." The War on Boys, again by Christina Hoff, Hoff Sommers, Sommers. That's a classic. Another book by Warren Farrell, Farrell, about the boy crisis.
Mm,
It's a fairly new book. Um, I've already mentioned the book by Carrie Gress, How Destroying the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Women. And then the book about red feminism I'm blocking on the name of that author, but if you search under Red Feminism, you will find that book. It is scholarly, it is detailed, and it is just absolutely convincing. So those are those are three of many books that are out there on this topic.
This has been just a great conversation. And one of the things that it's highlighted is that the world needs good, strong, well adjusted, responsible men in our society in order to have a properly functioning society. And also, when the reality is, those women who are out there and are looking for a man, that's the man they're looking for. And it seems to me that the work that you're doing with Davia is aimed at trying to protect those men, trying to restore their dignity, so that we actually have a society where men can live out their best selves, so that they'll actually become the kind of men that women would want to mate with. And without that, really, we're not going to have much of a society, are we, Edward?
Yeah, if you look at the twin problems of plummeting marriage rates and plummeting fertility rates, obviously those two are linked to each other. But just give one example. It used to be, if you go back 30 years, Spain and Europe had one of the highest fertility rates of any country in Europe. Well, then they passed a law in Spain that was a domestic violence law that simply recognized only the existence of male perpetrated abuse and literally would not recognize the existence of male victims. Guess what? The beginning, just within 5 years after that law was passed, the fertility rate and the marriage rate began to plummet. Now Spain has one of the very lowest marriage rates of any country in Europe. It's
Mm.
pretty easy to pin it directly on that biased domestic violence law.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, Edward, I want to thank you again for spending this time with us. God bless you and all the work that you're doing with Davia. Please continue the fight, and I hope to have you back here sometime in the future when maybe these statistics look a little bit better on the male side of the ledger. But thank you so much for being our special guest here on Gray Matter.
It's been my pleasure, Leighton. Great to chat with you. I think we have a lot in common, and hopefully we'll be able to connect in person one of these days.
Great, thank you.